Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really going to try and get this deep dive into focus because we're zooming in on a massive global challenge: myopia.
It really is huge. We're talking, what, 2.6 billion people affected right now?
Exactly, and projected to hit half the global population by 2050. That's staggering. And nearly a billion of those could have high myopia, worse than -5, with all the risks that entails impairment, even blindness.
Yeah, it's a major public health concern. And while myopia control spectacles have really taken off, I think they hit like 15% of myopia management prescribing by 2022.
Right.
The actual mechanisms, how they work, well, that's still hotly debated.
Which brings us to today's topic. We're looking at this fascinating debate: contrast theory versus blur theory. Two different takes on how the eye actually controls its growth.
That's the core tension, yeah. Two really distinct ways of thinking about it.
So our mission today is to unpack the science behind these ideas, and then we'll dive into a really critical new study on diffusion optics technology DOT lenses, looking specifically at how they affect kids' vision over 3 years of wear. If you want to understand how these newer lenses actually perform long-term and what it means for your patients, this is definitely one to listen to.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We know these myopia control specs are everywhere now. Can you give us the sort of high-level view? How do they generally try to slow down that eye elongation?
Sure. So basically, lenses like DIMS, HAL, and these DOT lenses we'll discuss, they all have these special optical elements, usually in the periphery of the lens. Yeah. The shared goal is to change the profile of light hitting the retina, to kind of send a slow-down growth signal. But, and this is the interesting part, they seem to be based on different underlying theories.
Right.
You've got the classic blur theory. The core idea there is that hypertropic defocus, basically blurry images landing behind the retina, like in farsightedness, stimulates the eye to grow longer. The eye is trying to minimize that blur. It's often called growing to clarity.
Growing to clarity, I like that. But then you mentioned contrast theory, which sounds like a pretty radical departure. What's the main idea there?
It really is quite different. Contrast theory proposes that the activity within the contrast signaling pathways of the retina, that's the sole driver of eye growth during refractive development.
The sole driver, that's a strong claim.
It is, and this activity, it argues, can come from clear, sharp images, which sounds a bit odd at first, or even from like spurious signals, false activity in the retina, sometimes caused by genetic factors.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. I know the Neitz review highlighted some discoveries that really opened our eyes to this contrast theory. Can you tell us about that genetic link they found?
Yeah, that was a real breakthrough. They discovered that specific variations, haplotypes, in the genes coding for our L and M cone opsins, the red and green sensitive cones, can cause a sort of glitch during RNA processing. It makes those cones really inefficient at actually absorbing light. And these specific variations are strongly linked to extreme myopia. We're talking over 10 diopters sometimes. It was first seen in something called Bornholm eye disease, but the key point is these myopia-causing variants can exist totally separately from color blindness. You can have normal color vision and still have these inefficient cones.
So inefficiency in the cones.
Yeah.
How does that connect back to contrast signaling driving eye growth?
Okay, so it connects via the midget bipolar cells. These are the main conduits from the cones, crucial for sharp, black and white, high detail vision. They act as very precise contrast detectors.
Right, center surround fields and all that.
Exactly. So when those cones are inefficient because of the mutations, they basically send out spurious signals. They tell the bipolar cells, hey, there's contrast here, even when the light is perfectly uniform.
So false alarms.
Pretty much. And this constant spurious contrast signaling acts as a really potent internal trigger telling the eye to grow longer. And what's significant is these common opsin variants are found in maybe a quarter of the population, and they increase myopia risk by over 300%.
300%.
Yeah.
That's substantial.
It really is. So contrast theory sees this signaling as the kind of final common pathway. It connects both the genetic risk and environmental influences on myopia development.
But wait, hold on. There seems to be a paradox here, doesn't there?
Yeah.
We all know about form deprivation myopia, the idea that reducing contrast, like putting a diffuser over an eye, causes myopia. Yet the genetic evidence points to excess contrast signaling causing it. How do we square that circle? It's not just a blur of information, is it?
Nice one. No, it's a very sharp point, and it is a paradox. Both things seem true. a lack of contrast, like with diffusers in dim lab light, which is key evidence for blur theory, and this spurious contrast signaling from genetics can drive eye growth.
So how do we reconcile them?
The proposed reconciliation involves retinal adaptation. You see, in very low contrast or low light, the retina cranks up its sensitivity, its gain.
Okay.
This amplification can make the retina's own internal noise significant enough to trigger those spurious growth signals. But crucially, in bright light, think outdoors, maybe 25,000 lux, more like our evolutionary environment. That internal noise gets swamped, it's less relevant. And this might explain why, under bright light conditions, diffusers can sometimes even lead to hyperopia, which actually fits better with contrast theory's predictions.
Fascinating. So the lighting conditions really matter. Okay, what does this difference mean for how the eye figures out if it needs to grow longer or shorter? How does it know the sign of the defocus, whether it's hyperopic or myopic? Do the theories agree on that?
That's another key difference. Blur theory generally assumes the eye's growth mechanism has to detect the sign of defocus directly, maybe using cues like image divergence or chromatic aberration, LCA.
Okay.
Contrast theory says, nope, not necessarily. It doesn't require the growth mechanism itself to know the sign. Instead, it relies heavily on accommodation, on focusing.
How so?
Think about it. If you have a slightly aperopic eye, accommodating, focusing can bring distant objects in your peripheral vision into sharp, high-contrast focus. According to contrast theory, that high contrast drives growth.
Makes sense.
But if you have a myopic eye, accommodating actually makes those distant peripheral objects more blurry, reducing contrast, and that inhibits growth. So the theory suggests that just through normal focusing, the average contrast hitting the peripheral retina naturally goes down as an eye grows from hyperopic towards myopic.
That's a clever mechanism.
Yeah.
And this difference, in theory, must have real-world impacts on lens design, especially for these DOT lenses we mentioned.
Absolutely. You see it in the designs. Many modern lenses, DIMS, HALT, CARE, they aim to lower peripheral contrast, often by adding quite a bit of positive power out there. Like DIMS uses those plus 3.50D microlenslets, CARE adds plus 8.0D of cylinder.
Right, creating peripheral myopic defocus.
Exactly, which fits perfectly with contrast theory. Lower the contrast via myopic blur, slow the growth. DOT lenses, though, take a slightly different tack. They're designed to give really good, clear vision across the whole lens because of the single vision background. But what they do is superimpose this very uniform, subtle field of scattered light over the image. It lowers the overall contrast slightly, but evenly, everywhere. So the child gets good vision wherever they look, but with that gentle, constant contrast reduction signal. It avoids the potential distortion you might get from those high-plus micro lenses.
Okay, that sets the stage nicely. Now let's turn our attention to this crucial study by Wolffsohn and colleagues that really put these DOT lenses to the test over the long term. Can you walk us through the methods they used?
Sure. This was a well-designed study. They looked at 51 kids, aged 10 to 14, average age around 12. These kids were already part of a longer trial, the Cypress Extension Study, and had been wearing either DOT lenses, that was 27 of them, or standard single-vision lenses, 24 of them, for at least 3 years.
So established wearers.
Exactly. It was done across 6 sites in North America. They checked the kid specs regularly, updated them if the prescription changed by more than half a diopter. And all the testing was done looking straight ahead, through the main part of the lens, including that 5mm clear zone in the DOT lenses.
Okay, what did they measure?
A whole battery of things, really. Binocular distance vision, both high contrast like a standard chart and low contrast. Binocular near vision, importantly, with glare sources added, simulating reading near a window or lamp.
Realistic conditions.
Yep. They did detailed contrast sensitivity testing across different spatial frequencies, stereo acuity depth perception using random dot tests. Functional reading speed was key. Maximum speed, average speed, print size needed, all measured using a digital chart on an iPad.
Yeah.
And this is quite neat. They objectively tracked head posture, yaw, pitch, roll, using AI facial recognition to see if kids were tilting their heads unnaturally.
Oh, interesting. To rule out compensation.
Precisely. And finally, they measured glare perception, specifically the size of halos around lights using a holometer. The statistical analysis was robust to mixed effect models, and crucially, they used non-inferiority margins.
Explain that bit, non-inferiority.
Right. It means they weren't just looking if DOT was different from single vision, but whether any difference was smaller than a predefined amount considered clinically unimportant. For instance, 0.1 log MR for visual acuity, or 0.4 degrees for the halo size. They set a threshold for good enough. And the study had high power, 95%, to detect real differences if they existed.
Okay, solid methods.
Yeah.
So, the big question, what were the results? Did the DOT lenses hold up visually after 3 years? No need to squint to see the implications here.
The results were pretty clear-cut, actually. First off, the groups were well-matched. Age, sex, race, all similar. Visual acuity. Excellent in both groups and statistically similar. Mean distance, high contrast VA was about -0.09 log MAR for DOT, -0.08 for single vision. That's better than 20/20 for most. Low contrast VA, near VA with glare again, significant differences.
What about contrast sensitivity itself?
Also similar. No significant differences found across the spatial frequencies tested. And importantly, for most frequencies, the DOT lenses met that non-inferiority criterion. They weren't clinically worse.
Okay. Stereopsis. Reading.
Stereopsis was great in both groups, around 30-something arc seconds, no significant difference. Reading speeds, both maximum and mean, critical print size, minimum text size, all statistically similar. Max reading speed was right around 200 words per minute for both.
And the head posture. Any weird tilt?
Nope. The objective AI tracking found no significant differences in yaw, pitch, or roll between the groups. That's really reassuring, suggests kids weren't having to adopt funny postures to see well, which could cause other issues.
Definitely good news. Okay, what about the glare, the halos? You mentioned that was measured specifically.
Right. So the mean halo radius was statistically slightly larger with the DOT lenses 0.56 degrees versus 0.50 degrees for single vision. The p-value is 0.02, so statistically significant.
So there was a difference there.
There was, but, and this is the key point, the non-inferiority analysis highlights that difference of 0.06 degrees was much smaller than the predefined non-inferiority margin of 0.4 degrees.
Got it. So measurable on average, but too small to be considered clinically meaningful.
Exactly. Any difference in perceived halo was clinically insignificant. So you could say it provides a hello good vision effect without troublesome glare.
So wrapping up the study findings, essentially, DOT lenses provided a clinically equivalent visual experience to standard single vision lenses, even after 3 years. That must be a sight for sore eyes for practitioners considering them.
That's the main takeaway, yes. Despite having those light-scattering elements designed to modulate contrast, the lenses delivered excellent visual function across the board: acuity, contrast, stereo, reading, and importantly, normal head posture. The slightly larger statistical halo was clinically irrelevant. It strongly suggests wearing these lenses isn't likely to negatively impact a child's daily life, their schoolwork, their activities.
This deep dive really shows how these theories, contrast versus blur, can lead to different practical solutions like DOT lenses, and how vital this kind of long-term real-world research is for understanding the full impact on kids. The whole idea that reducing contrast, not necessarily inducing traditional blur, could be the key. It opens up interesting possibilities, especially thinking about those kids with genetic predispositions we talked about.
It really does. And it leads to a provocative thought, perhaps. If contrast theory holds true, and that spurious contrast signaling is a major driver, especially for those with genetic risks, what about treating pre-myopic children?
Before they even show refractive error.
Potentially. Could lenses that proactively reduce the overall contrast burden even before myopia manifests be a future strategy? It's certainly something to ponder as we learn more.
Definitely food for thought. Well, we hope this deep dive helped you get a clearer vision on myopia control theories and the performance of DOT lenses. If you enjoyed this content and want to stay focused on the latest in eye care, please do follow the deep dive wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you found this particularly illuminating, maybe consider leaving us a 5-star rating. It genuinely helps other eye care professionals find the show.
Absolutely. And for anyone who wants to dig into the specifics of the study we discussed today, the Wolffsohn et al. Paper, you'll find a link to the full journal article right there in the podcast description. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.